Hey, everybody. I am out of breath. I ran all the way here. It's a terrible joke, but you laughed. Anyway, that's why I love you, 10 o'clock. Nate mentioned this a couple minutes ago. My name's Jared, by the way. I work here. Nate mentioned this a couple minutes ago, but just want to remind everybody, FPU is coming up, starts next week, Financial Peace University. And that's just, as Nate mentioned, we've had over 600 people go through that. It doesn't matter if you have $10 to your name or $10 million to your name. I mean, it's just such an amazing class to figure out how to manage God's resources that he has entrusted to you and to me. And so if you are interested in that, you can go to the atrium, find out more about that, or you can go to our website, find out more information about that. And after you finish the class, we give you a bunch of money, which is just great. So it's a joke. Again, we're like 0 for 2, you and me. Also, baptism today at La Jolla Shores. We're going to be in La Jolla at 3:30, Tower 33. And if you are new to church or you've been on the fence about faith and what you believe, but you're kind of at a point where you're ready to be baptized or accept Christ, we'd love to talk to you more about that after our service. There's still time to be baptized today. We would love to talk to you about what it means to follow Jesus, and we'd love to celebrate that with you. We don't believe baptism is what saves you, but we believe it's a way when you're baptized that we celebrate that God has redeemed and called you his own. And so we'd love to celebrate that with you today. We'll dive into our new series together. I want you to imagine for just a moment, just play along. Imagine for just a second that you're God, okay? For some of you, this is gonna be really, really easy, okay? Don't point at anybody, but Bill, this sermon's for you. You love to think you're God. But just imagine for a second that you're God and you are coming into this world and you have a limited window of time to tell people who you are, what you've come into this world to do. You have this little, slice of time to tell people that you love them, that you're planned for salvation, you're planned to help people. I mean, just imagine whether you're Christian or not a Christian, just imagine. You're God. What communication strategy would you pick? Would you tweet it out? Would you make a viral video? I mean, what would you do? Would you make a documentary? Would you go on CNN, Fox News, grab as many microphones as you possibly could? I mean, what would your communication strategy be if you're God and you have a limited window of time to tell people who you are? And the reason I say that is because 2,000 years ago, that's the exact situation that Jesus found himself in. He came into this world. He moved into the neighborhood. God moved into the neighborhood. It was God in a bod walking around. And he has a limited window of time to tell people, 3.5 years, who he is and what he's come into this world to do. And so over and over again, when you read the stories of Jesus in the New Testament, he's essentially chosen some communication strategies to tell people who he is. You see Jesus quite often. He's doing miracles. He's healing the sick. He's restoring sight to the blind. He's raising the dead. And for Jesus, that's just a communication strategy to say this is what it's like when God shows up. This is what the nature of God is like. That's a pretty good, communication strategy if you have that one in your tool belt to do miracles. That was one of them he chose. Another one he chose, and if I'm God, I have a limited window of time. I'm not so sure I would have chosen this particular strategy, but you see Jesus primarily, he's either doing miracles or he's telling stories. That's his other communication strategy. And for the next few weeks, I want to talk about one story in particular that he tells, but it's bizarre that this is what he decided to do, to tell people that, he's God. He just, tells stories involving everyday objects over and over again. The sort of big church word for this is parables. He tells these parables, and often they're confusing. It's something about, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, or kind of pick another everyday. Well, let me tell you the one about the farmer. I mean, he's just sort of telling these stories over and over again. And if you've ever read these stories before and you've been confused, you're in really good company, because when you read these stories, the disciples, the 12 people who knew Jesus the best, they're often confused when Jesus would tell one of these stories. In fact, oftentimes you'll see Peter or one of the disciples kind of on the sidelines when Jesus is telling a story like, boss, this one's going too long, man. This is, do some more miracles. People like the miracles, but nobody knows what you're talking about when you tell these stories. And there's one story in particular. It's the flagship, or it's the hallmark story of the parables. It's the story of the prodigal son. How many of you you've heard of this story? You've read this story before? Yeah. Many of us. There's a story that Jesus tells that even if you're not a Christian, it's just a brilliant literary piece. The way that Jesus tells the story, it's just one afternoon in the middle of Israel. He tells this story of a prodigal son. And on the surface, we tell the story as if it's a story about one son that gets lost. But in reality, it's a story about two sons that get lost for very, very different reasons. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to take a look at this story of the prodigal son. And there's three people primarily that are in the story. There's the two boys and there's the father. And this week, we're going to take a look at one of the sons. Next week, we're going to take a look at the father. And then we're going to come back, and the third week, we're going to talk about the oldest son. If you have a Bible, turn with me to Luke chapter 15. We're going to start in verse 1 together. Matthew, Mark, Luke. A few Star Wars fans there, apparently. There's so many terrible jokes this morning, sorry. I'm going to clean this up by the 11:30. You should come back, I promise. Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 1 is where the story begins. And let me just set a little bit of context for this. And if you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screens, or you can download the CRB app. That's a great place to follow along as well. Everywhere that Jesus goes, when he does miracles or when he tells stories, his two primary communication strategies, there's always a contentious crowd that's gathered. And this crowd on this particular afternoon, you have the Pharisees, who are the religious elite. They're the good people. They're the goodest of the good. And we often kind of talk about them as if they're, kind of maniacal and cartoonish, but they're real people. These are real stories. Around 6,000 Pharisees lived in the world of Jesus. And on the other side of the dividing line is the sinners. That's just kind of the everyday people. It's also, you have some really bad people that are mixed into that crowd, the tax collectors, and that's not just the IRS. That's people who literally, they steal money for a living from the impoverished and the poor people. And so you hated the tax collectors, you have the prostitutes, you have just all the sinners are kind of lumped in there together. And so when Jesus starts talking, there's a dividing line. I would imagine there was some arguing that had gone on in this crowd on this particular day. And this sort of sets the table for the story that Jesus is going to tell. Starting in Luke 15, chapter 15, starting verse 1. Now the tax collectors, who were thieves, and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees, the dividing line has been drawn on this particular afternoon, and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." That was the accusation against Jesus. This man welcomes sinners. One of the things that you see about Jesus, in fact, for some of us, you're not a Christian, but one of the things that you like about Jesus is when you read stories about Jesus, people who are nothing like Jesus always liked Jesus, didn't they? People that had nothing in common with Jesus, the unclean, the sinners, the people that had no religious affiliation, they always loved being around Jesus. They found Jesus, the sinners in the world of Jesus, found him irresistible to be around. They were constantly, and that's not true in our world when it comes to Christians. Often people are repulsed by Christians and the way Christians act or behave. But in the world of Jesus, people who were nothing like Jesus really liked being around Jesus. And in this particular moment, it's the Pharisees, it's the good people who have an issue with Jesus. And their issue is who he's eating with. Now, this sounds bizarre to us, but in the first century world, there was a big debate in religious circles in the world that Jesus lived in around who you could eat with. It was called the debate around table fellowship, was sort of the formal name for it. And essentially, this is a world of caste systems. You're not allowed to eat with particular people. And the reason is, because I would argue this is even true in our world, when you ate with someone, this is not just about chips and salsa that you're sharing with someone. This is about you're dignifying somebody who does not deserve it. If you ate with someone, that was a way of giving dignity to an individual. And so the contention that the Pharisees, the religious people, have with Jesus is, he's giving dignity to all the wrong people. You cannot dignify the prostitutes. You cannot dignify the tax collectors. You should not eat with those people. And if I'm Jesus in this moment, I would, sort of rev up and give a sermon, 5 points, and here's the reasons why I do what I do. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he's going to tell a series of 3 stories. The Pharisees are angry with him, and Jesus says, well, let me tell you a story about a shepherd. And he tells this story about a shepherd, and the point of the story is to say that God is like a shepherd, which right there would be scandalous in the world of Jesus. Shepherds are dirty, they're unclean. We're kind of used to that image of God as a shepherd. But this is a culture where you're not even allowed to speak the name of God, let alone compare God to a dirty, filthy shepherd. But that's what Jesus says. He says, God's like a shepherd who has 100 sheep. He loses one of the sheep, and instead of, just kind of hanging out with the 99, he goes after the one. He finds the one that's lost, and when he finds it, he celebrates that this one is back home. This is what God is like. And then he tells another story. He says, God is like a housewife, which right there, the Pharisees religiously would be, you cannot say that, Jesus. He says, God's like a housewife who has a bunch of coins, has 10 coins, and she loses one of the coins. Instead of, celebrating the 9 that she still has, she goes after the one. And when she finally finds the one that's lost, this is what God is like. This housewife will celebrate. And I'm sure the crowd's kind of scratching their head. Why are you telling us these stories? And then he's going to tell them the story of the prodigal son, which is sort of the capstone of these 3 stories, which is a way for the crowd on that particular day to tell the Pharisees and the sinners why it is that Jesus eats with who he eats with. And he tells them the story of the prodigal son. If you have a Bible, the story is Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11. And we're going to look at the story of the youngest son today. And we're going to come back next week and talk about the father, but here's sort of the little bit of preview for next week. The word prodigal, it just means extravagant. And we attach that word to the youngest son, as we're going to see in this story today. But at the heart of the story, it's not so much about a son who lives an extravagant and wild lifestyle, a prodigal lifestyle. It's ultimately a story about a prodigal father who is extravagant and wasteful to an extent, and the grace that he's going to give to his son who's run away. So there's just a whole other dimension to the story for next week. Luke chapter 15, we're going to start in verse 11 together. This is the third of the stories that Jesus tells. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, so this is the one that's typically called the prodigal, Father, give me my share of the estate or my inheritance. And so the father divided his property between them. Now, this isn't a true story about, an actual son and father. This is a story Jesus is telling to point to a larger truth. But he's essentially saying in this moment, there's this boy who comes to his dad and says, give me my inheritance. And the dad, for whatever reason, okay, here you go. On the surface, this sounds like a story about bad parenting, doesn't it? This kid hasn't taken a Dave Ramsey class. He hasn't taken FPU. You're just going to hand him the sweaty wad of cash, and that moment is just sort of bizarre. And the crowd would be like, what is this? Where are you going with this story, Jesus? Well, the crowd would also know this is a shame, honor-based society, and what this boy has essentially done is not just ask for some money. This kid has ultimately shamed his father, because in this culture, you could not get your inheritance until your father was dead. So essentially what this boy has done is he said to his dad on this particular afternoon, Dad, I wish you were dead. I wish you would drop dead. So the story ultimately begins with the heartbreak of a father and his rebellious son who says, Dad, I wish you weren't even alive. And this would bring immense shame to the dad. It would bring immense shame to the entire village. Word would start to get around. You're not going to believe what Bill's son did. You're not going to believe. He doesn't want to be a part of our village anymore. He's decided to move off and do his own thing. We have no cultural equivalent to the amount of shame that this boy has brought to his people. They would be like, he's a traitor. I can't believe he did that. I can't believe he doesn't want to be one of us. Dean Spanos is about the only thing I can think of that gets close. Like a little bit, a little bit. Really cheer that one, man. It's awesome. Move away to the Gentile land of Los Angeles, where they worship a golden ram and just all sorts of spiritual implications. Left the Holy Land, just the layers of the story. Some of you are like, now I actually understand the story. Thank you so much. That's essentially what's going on. And the way that Jesus tells the story, it's brilliant in the literary devices that he uses. He tells the story like a cliffhanger where the rebellion of this kid, it just keeps piling up. The consequences just keep piling up over and over again. Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 13. It says, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country. This is the Los Angeles, if you're keeping score at home. which the code word there is Gentile. He's gone to live with the Gentiles, which this is a tribal society. You would never do this. And there he squandered his wealth, his father's money, in wild living. And after he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he goes and hires himself, this is the prodigal, the youngest son, hires himself out to a citizen of that country. So the crowd, the religious elite, and the sinners would hear this, and they would say, wait a second. Not only has he gone to live with Gentiles, not only has he shamed his father, now he's going to work for a Gentile? This kid, I mean, this is like Justin Bieber level rebellion. I mean, this is like escalating, like unbelievable. And it says that he hires himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And the way that Jesus is telling the story, he's essentially saying, not only has he shamed the father, not only has he gone to live with Gentiles, not only is he now working for a Gentile, but now he's living with unclean animals. So there's a religious implication to the story. The crowd was just like, man, this kid, unbelievable. It's a cliffhanger. You would wonder, what is going to happen next? Verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. We're going to talk more about this next week, but he has this moment where he comes to his senses. There's a moment of a wake up of, why in the world am I in a pig pen, for crying out loud? How did I get here? I do not belong here. And I would argue he begins to experience a dosage of healthy shame in this moment. And I know we always think about shame as if it's an all bad thing, but there's a kind of shame, there's a healthy shame that when you begin to experience it, it can actually be a good thing. I don't mean that to say if you have shame, it's always a great thing and you should celebrate it, but the right amount of shame is a lot like medicine. The right amount of it can actually begin to make you well. You can take a lethal dosage of it, but the right amount of it is what hits this kid in this moment, and he's going, I am in a pig pen, for crying out loud, and the right amount of shame can cause you and can cause me to go, I am currently living somewhere I do not belong. I'm currently engaged in a set of behaviors that this is not who I am. Some of us today, you walked into church and there's a shame that's been lingering in your heart and soul. There's an amount of shame that you carry around over an addiction, over a set of behaviors, a way of life, and there's something in your head and heart that goes, wait a minute, this is not where I belong. I would argue that's a degree of healthy shame to start going, wait a minute, if I lean into this, I'll start to come to my senses and walk out of the pig pen that I'm in. And if you still have the capacity for shame, that means that you still have the capacity to hear the Father's voice, although it might be a faint whisper in the back of your head that says, you are currently somewhere that you do not belong. That's healthy shame that begins to set in. And it's not the father who shames the boy, and it's not God who shames you, and it's not God who shames me, but God will use shame in our life to cause us to begin to wake up and look around and go, wait a second, I'm currently somewhere that I do not belong. And we can begin to find our way home and hear the Father's voice. You ever met somebody who doesn't feel shame at all? They can treat people terrible, they can act horrible, doesn't bother them at all. That's when it's destructive. But if you can feel shame, that means you can still hear the Father's voice no matter how far away you are. I would argue shame is a lot like a rope. Healthy shame can be like a rope. And you could do a lot of things with a rope, but if you grab it, you take hold of it, it's healthy shame, it will actually begin to pull you back into the arms of the Father. And sometimes the right amount, the right dosage of shame enters into our lives, and God is offering us a rope in that moment to say, you are currently somewhere you do not belong, and I'm trying to pull you out of that pit. But you can do a lot of things with a rope. You can also begin to hang yourself with it. And that healthy shame can begin to reach toxic levels, but we need a certain degree of shame. It pulls us out of situations and circumstances. And that's what happens for this kid. He begins to go, I'm in a pig pen, for crying out loud. I do not belong in this particular location. Shame is a lot like fear. You don't want to live your life dominated with fear, but when you're driving on the freeway, you want a healthy fear of oncoming traffic. That's a good thing. That's how shame works. It can actually begin to pull us back into the arms of the Father. It's a rope that God often extends. And if you have some shame in your life today, it's not always a bad thing. It can become a really destructive thing, which is ultimately what's going to happen for this kid. But you find this kid, he knows where he is. He starts to look around. I do not belong in the pig pen. And the crowd would lean in this moment, and they would know that Jesus is talking about the sinners, and he's going to talk about the religious people in just a moment. But essentially, this kid looks up and says, I got to go home. In verse 18, I love this. He rehearses the speech he's going to give his dad. I love this part. I will set out and go back to my father, and I'm going to say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. I love that. He rehearses the speech. When I was a kid, that's how I knew I was in a lot of trouble. When I started working through the speech, I was going to tell my dad. You remember those moments? I'm going to tell Dad. I did not realize that the town water tower was not bulletproof. I always thought it was bulletproof. I have sinned against heaven and against you, Dad. I'm so sorry. I would work through the speech. Dad, I didn't realize a paintball gun could actually do that to another human. I just had no idea. Dad, I didn't realize there was a person in the porta-john when I flipped it down the hill. These may or may not be real life examples, by the way. But when you're rehearsing the speech, that's when it's bad. And this kid, he's like, man, I'm going to tell Dad this when I get home. And so he makes his way home. I don't know how long the journey was, but he finds himself walking out of the distant country back into the village. And it says this, when he gets home, he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. We're going to talk more about that next week. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. So he gives the speech he rehearsed. I love that. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And he says to his dad in that moment, I'm not even worth being called your son. Which that seems like a massive leap out of, I did something wrong. Now he's standing before the Father and he's going, I am something wrong. And the word worthy here is this Greek word axios. It's an economic term that he uses. And essentially that word for worthy that he uses, axios, it essentially means bankrupt. I'm a zero on the economic scale of value. And he's standing before the dad and he's saying in this moment, I don't even have anything. I'm worth absolutely nothing. You can reject me, cut me off. I know what I deserve. I don't know how he got that far. I don't know how he got from I did something wrong to I am something wrong. But I think for a lot of us in the building today, you've made that leap. And that's when shame goes from being something that's healthy to being something that's toxic and begins to choke us. When we make a leap in our lives, and for some of us, it's a suffocating leap, but you make this leap every day from I did something that was wrong to now I am something that's wrong. And that's the toxic leap of shame. That's the leap that we often make. And that's always a recipe to suffocating in your own shame. When you go from I did something wrong, I'm in a pig pen, to all of a sudden, I am something wrong. And you go, well, how did the kid get from I did, therefore I am? I mean, that's a massive leap. Well, this kid would know what was coming, and for the audience that was gathered there, they would expect the end to the story would end with what was called a kazeza. That was a typical ceremony you would conduct. It was a shame ceremony, and the crowd would certainly know this was true, and this was what you would expect in terms of how the story would end. You would expect that this father in the village would conduct what was called a kazeza around this boy. A kazeza, it's a word that just literally means to cut off. And if somebody, and this is a tribal, village-oriented communal society, if you had done something, whether you married somebody you weren't supposed to, or you had brought shame to yourself or to your father, they would conduct a kazeza, which was a shame ceremony, which was a way to cut you off from the village and say, you're not worth anything to us. And so what a kazeza was, I know this sounds bizarre, but you would take a jar, it could be a glass container, it could be a clay pot filled with corn and nuts and burned beans. You would take this, and whoever you were going to cut off from the village to declare was not worth anything to you, you would smash this in their presence, and the corn and the nuts and the beans would just sort of flow into the floor, and the glass would just, or the clay would just sort of shatter around that person. It's called a kazeza. It was a first century shame ceremony. I know that sounds bizarre. I don't know if you've ever, like some weird thing to do. I don't even know how that worked. I don't know if it was, okay, Bill, you go get the corn. I'm going to grab the container. I don't know if they had a guy in the village. That was his job. You're the kazeza guy. You're the director of kazezas. Man, it's your time. We got another shame ceremony today. Oh boy, go fill the jar. I don't know how that worked. But this kid knew what was coming in his direction when he came home. He knew what he deserved. And so he walks in the door. Give it to me, Dad. I know it's coming in my direction. And I know we don't still do shame ceremonies. Maybe for your dog, and you post a photo of them doing something, you dog shame them, but we don't still do shame ceremonies in our culture. But I think we still do shame ceremonies all the time in our head and heart. And I think for a lot of us, you've never put a formal word on it. You've never called it a shame ceremony, but every day of your life, you're making that toxic leap from, I did something wrong, therefore I am something wrong. And it might be in the privacy of your own home or your own head and heart. It maybe never comes out of your mouth, but you have a little shame ceremony all the time. A little kazeza that you conduct in your own head and heart. For some of us, the way it looks for you is your shame ceremony is you're an inflator. And what I mean by an inflator is you've decided somewhere along the way that one bad act, the one thing you did that was wrong, has been inflated, and now that means you're just one bad person. And it's a little shame ceremony. You go through life conducting that shame ceremony all the time. And anything in your current reality, in your sphere of relationships, you think back all the time on that thing that you did. It wasn't just you got a divorce, it's now you are divorced. You've inflated that as an identity. And you've blown it up to be the biggest reality about yourself. Well, shame ceremony all the time. And the power of this story, the reason Jesus is telling that story to the religious people on that day is he's saying there's not gonna be any shame ceremonies in the presence of Jesus today. And for you and me, 2,000 years later, in light of the cross, in light of the resurrection, there are no shame ceremonies in the presence of Jesus. And the power of this story for the audience, and the power of this story in 2017 is that the reality that Christ has spoken from the empty grave about who you are, that you are the loved sons and daughters of a perfect Father in heaven, regardless of what you've done. And your identity as the loved sons and daughters of a perfect Father is bigger than anything you've ever done in your life. And he inflates your identity to be bigger than any of our sins or failures. He says there's no dividing lines and there's no shame ceremonies in the presence of Jesus. Some of us go through life and you're an inflator. That's your shame ceremony. Happens every day. Some of us, you go through life and you're a comparer. Your shame is always in comparison. Every time you get online, every time you call your sister back home in Des Moines, and every time someone else's successes just mean your failure. And you'll see a friend post a photo on vacation. It just makes you think about all the vacations you haven't taken. It makes you think about the vacation that didn't go well. You call your sister, how are you guys? We're great. We just bought a boat. Oh, that's fantastic. It just makes you think about the boat you don't own. It just makes you walk through all the things in life you haven't accomplished. You walk in, standing next to the coffee machine on a Monday morning. How was your weekend, Hannah? Oh, it was fantastic. You have a little shame ceremony right there at the coffee machine at work, just thinking about your terrible weekend. Somebody else's successes just always mean your failure. Every time you get on Instagram, every time you get on Facebook, you scroll through your news feed, it's just have yourself a little shattered glass shame ceremony right there. Some of us go through life. That's your kazeza. That's your shame ceremony. It happens every single day. Some of us, you're a projector. And what a projector, see, the problem is you know the worst about yourself. You know what you did spring break 1986. You know what you did last summer. You know what you did last summer, part 2. You know, I don't know if it's the right crowd for that reference. But a projector, everyone must have the same negative thoughts about you that you have about yourself. And so you just assume everybody at work, everybody in your small group has already read your diary, and they've already indicted you of all the same things you've indicted yourself on. And so what happens is you find yourself isolated. You find yourself cutting yourself off from relationships because you don't want to feel rejected again, because you're constantly projecting your failures onto other people, assuming they think the same things are true about you that are playing in your head. The same tapes. They probably have the same tapes playing in their head about you that you have playing about yourself. And it just projects over and over again, a little shame ceremony all the time, where what you've done has become bigger than who you are in Christ. Some of us, you're a translator. I have a degree in translation. I'm so good at this. In fact, my wife Rosanna is here. She might get up at the end of this message and just walk you through how great at translation I am. But a translator is anytime you hear a minor criticism, it gets translated into a major attack of your character. And so what happens is somebody will say something to you, a little minor criticism, might be your wife comes home and says, hey, you forgot to take out the trash. What you hear, what you translate that is, honey, you are trash. And you translate all day, anything anybody says to you. And so what happens is somebody will fire a BB gun of criticism in your direction, and you pick up a bazooka and respond. Because you're just translating all day. Anything negative that comes in your direction, your skin has become so thin over the years. A little shame ceremony takes place every time. And you find yourself responding every time, well, I know I'm not perfect. You ever said that before? Which is just great when people say that. It's like, well, thank you for clearing that up. We were all debating earlier if you were perfect. Thank you for settling that discussion for us. A translator. Some of us, it's maybe because you grew up in a strict religious household, but you're an exaggerator. And a petty fault will begin to feel like a major moral disaster. Maybe because you were made to feel guilty for things when you were little. And your mom, your dad, a priest, a preacher would have a little shame ceremony for you every time you did something wrong. And all these years later, you're still carrying that around. And you don't know the difference between finding $1 on the street or robbing a bank. And you beat yourself up for months over something that should have lasted about 3 minutes in your head. And everything you ever do wrong just gets exaggerated, and you find yourself just shriveling up on the inside, just shame ceremony after shame ceremony after shame ceremony. And the power of this story, Jesus is essentially saying, for you and for me and for people on both sides of the dividing line 2,000 years ago, there are no shame ceremonies in the presence of Jesus. And it doesn't matter how big you've inflated your past to be, the reality of the Son of God speaking over you and me, that you're the loved sons and daughters of the perfect Father, is bigger than anything you've ever done. And the power of this story is what we'll see next week is a father who embraces the sinner, the father who throws his arms around the failures, the father who begins to lift up and bring dignity back to the son that everybody else wanted to take it away from. And the Son of God, and any one of us in this room who someone has taken dignity away from you because of something you did, or you've taken it away from yourself, the Son of God gives dignity back to those who've lost it and reminds us there's no shame ceremonies in the presence of Jesus. You might conduct a shame ceremony in your own head and heart. Somebody maybe has conducted a shame ceremony over you. But in the presence of Jesus, there are no shame ceremonies. And we're going to celebrate that together through song. I don't know where that lands on you today. I don't know if you're an exaggerator. I don't know if you're a comparer. I don't know if you're an inflator. I don't know if you're like me. You're like, I'm 5 for 5, man. But we're going to take the elements of communion, the Lord's Supper. And if you're a follower of Christ and you want to take these elements, we invite you to do that. The ushers are going to come at this time, and they're going to serve the bread, and they're going to serve the cup, the body, the blood of Christ. And I'm not going to lead you through that this morning. You can do that in the comfort of your own seat today. If you need, for some reason, assistance in getting the elements, you can raise your hand. One of our ushers will bring the elements to you. But essentially, as we take the elements of communion, my prayer today is that you would hear the voice of the Father who shatters the shame. And it might be for you that you live in a world of shattered glass, conducting shame ceremonies, but the voice of the Father shatters the shame that we carry around in life. And as you take the bread, as you take the cup, would you hear the voice of the Father who cries out to you, no matter how far away you are, that you are the loved Son. And there's no shame ceremonies in the presence of the Father today. Let's pray together. Jesus, we thank you that you saw fit to tell this story 2,000 years ago. And as you told the story, I imagine you were staring down the religious elite and you were lifting up the broken and the hurting, those whose behavior had discounted them, those whose choices had made them feel marginalized. And God, 2017, we don't shatter glass, we don't grab burned beans and corn, but God, we have shame ceremonies all the time. Some of the shame ceremonies in this room have been paralyzing. And shame has gone from healthy to disabling for some of us. It's ended relationships, it's caused friction with children. It's caused cognitive distortion and it's blurred every choice. Would you set us free today, Father? Remind us these elements of your body and the blood are there because there is no shame ceremonies in your presence. And as we take these elements today, Father, would you speak deep to our soul, clear up the distortion, set the captives free, bind up the brokenhearted. There are no shame ceremonies in your presence, Jesus. It's in the Son's name we pray.